The door opened without a knock. Lucky Luciano stepped into the room like a man who had already won a war no one else knew was being fought. In his right hand, a leather briefcase, worn at the edges, heavy, the kind of weight that makes a man's shoulder dip just slightly to one side. Behind him, the door closed. No bodyguards, no entourage. Just Luciano, the briefcase, and a room full of men who controlled every illegal dollar flowing through America's cities. This was 1929, the height of prohibition, the golden age of organized crime. And inside that private suite at the President Hotel in Atlantic City, the most powerful mobsters in the country had gathered for what would later be called the Atlantic City Conference. Meyer Lansky had organized it, a summit to end the violence, to create structure, to turn chaos into empire. But no one expected Luciano to walk in like that. No one expected the briefcase. And absolutely no one expected what he was about to do with the $120,000 inside it. The room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from respect, the kind that comes from confusion, from men realizing they might have miscalculated something fundamental. Meyer Lansky stood near the window, 32 years old, thin, quiet, the kind of man people underestimated until it was too late. He had spent weeks setting up this meeting, calling in favors, negotiating truces, convincing men who hated each other to sit in the same room. And now his closest ally had just walked in carrying enough cash to buy a dozen speakeasies. Luciano set the briefcase on the table. The leather thudded against wood. Every eye in the room locked onto it. Al Capone stopped mid-sentence. Frank Costello leaned forward. Joe Adonis crossed his arms. These were men who had seen fortunes come and go, who had killed for less than what was likely inside that case. But this wasn't about money. Not really. This was about something far more dangerous. Something that would reshape the entire underworld. This was about proving who understood power. If stories like this show you a side of Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano you never knew existed, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now, because what happened next in that room changed organized crime forever, and most people have no idea how close it came to ending in blood. To understand what Luciano did, you have to understand where the mob was in 1929. It was fractured, divided, drowning in its own violence. The old guard, the mustache Petes, still clung to tradition. Sicilian only, blood ties only. They saw the Irish, the Jews, the other Italians as outsiders, lesser, temporary. Men like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano controlled territories through fear and old-world rules. They demanded tribute. They settled disputes with bullets. They refused to evolve, and it was tearing everything apart. The Castellamarese War was brewing. Families were choosing sides. Bodies were dropping in the streets. Police pressure was increasing. Profits were declining. The whole operation, the entire golden goose of prohibition, was at risk because old men refused to see what was obvious to everyone else. The future wasn't Sicilian. It wasn't even Italian. The future was business. And two men understood that better than anyone, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. They had grown up together on the Lower East Side of New York. Lansky, a Jewish immigrant from Poland. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, brought to America as a child. Different backgrounds, different religions, same hunger. They met as kids. The story goes that Luciano tried to extort Lansky for protection money. Lansky refused. They fought. Neither won. And in that stalemate, they recognized something in each other. A refusal to accept the world as it was. A willingness to break every rule if it meant winning. By their 20s, they were running operations together. Bootlegging, gambling, narcotics. While other mobsters fought over ethnic territories, Lansky and Luciano built something new. A partnership based on profit, not blood. They brought in Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel, Joe Adonis, a multi-ethnic network that made more money in a month than the old families made in a year. But they were still under the thumb of the mustache Petes, still answering to Joe Masseria, still playing by rules they didn't believe in. The Atlantic City Conference was supposed to change that. Lansky had proposed it months earlier. Neutral ground, every major player, a chance to end the violence and create a national organization, a syndicate, where disputes were settled by commission, not by murder, where territories were respected, where everyone made money. The old bosses were skeptical. But the younger generation, the men who actually ran the streets, they saw the brilliance in it. They saw the future. So they came from New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Kansas City, New Orleans. The most powerful criminals in America gathered in one hotel suite, surrounded by the smell of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Lansky had prepared everything: agendas, proposals, a framework for how the new organization would work. He was the architect, the planner, the man who saw 10 moves ahead. But he knew that planning wasn't enough. These men didn't follow plan. They followed power. And power in their world had to be demonstrated, proven, made undeniable. That's where Luciano came in. The briefcase sat on the table like a bomb waiting to detonate. Luciano didn't open it immediately. He stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting the tension build. His eyes moved across the room, meeting each man's gaze. Capone, Costello, Adonis, Nucky Johnson, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden. These were not men who intimidated easily. These were men who had climbed to the top over the bodies of people who had underestimated them. They were watching Luciano with the cold calculation of predators assessing a potential threat. And Luciano was watching them back. He had learned something that most people never understand, that most of these so-called powerful men never figure out until it's too late. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. Real power is so certain of itself that it can afford to be quiet, to be patient, to let others make noise while it makes decisions. Luciano had that kind of power, not because he was the strongest, though he was strong, not because he was the most ruthless, though he could be ruthless when necessary, but because he understood the game at a level most people couldn't reach. He understood that in a room full of kings, the man who controls the money controls the kingdom. You watching this right now? You think you know how this ends? Lansky moved closer. His face was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. He knew what was coming. They had planned this, not the details perhaps, but the principle, the message. Luciano clicked open the briefcase. $120,000 in cash, stacked in neat bundles. More money than most people would see in a lifetime. More money than some of these operations made in a month. But here's what made it extraordinary. This wasn't Luciano's money. Not entirely. It was collective, pooled, contributions from operations he and Lansky controlled together. Money that represented not just wealth, but organization, discipline, the ability to coordinate across territories, across ethnic lines, across the old boundaries that had always kept the mob fragmented. This was proof, physical, undeniable proof, that the future Lansky was proposing wasn't just theory. It was already happening. Capone leaned back in his chair. He was the biggest name in the room, the most famous. The Chicago outfit printed money under his leadership, but even Capone understood what he was looking at. This wasn't about who had more. This was about who had more control. Luciano began to speak. His voice was calm, almost conversational. No theatrics, no speeches. He said that the money represented something simple, a treasury, a fund, seed capital for the new organization. Money that would be used to settle disputes, to fund operations that benefited everyone, to pay off politicians and police chiefs, to smooth over problems before they became wars. But more than that, it was proof of commitment. Every dollar in that case represented a choice to stop fighting each other, to stop burning resources on internal conflicts, to start building something bigger than any individual operation. And here's the part that made every man in that room understand exactly what was happening. Luciano made it clear. This money wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was the price of entry. Anyone who wanted to be part of the new syndicate, anyone who wanted access to the infrastructure Lansky was building, the political connections, the national coordination, the shared intelligence, they had to contribute. They had to show they were serious. They had to prove they understood that the old way, the way of individual fiefdoms and endless wars, was over. Some of the older bosses bristled. You could see it in their faces. The indignation, the pride. Who was Luciano to make demands? Who was Lansky to reorganize the entire underworld? But the younger men, the ones who actually understood economics, who saw the bigger picture, they got it immediately. This wasn't a shakedown. This was an investment opportunity, the best one they'd ever get. Frank Costello was the first to speak up. He had always been smart, political. He could read a room better than anyone, and he could see that the men who resisted this were going to be left behind, irrelevant, extinct. He said he was in. His operations would contribute. He understood what Lansky and Luciano were building, and he wanted to be part of it. Joe Adonis followed, then Bugsy Siegel, then others. One by one, the men in that room made a choice. Some made it enthusiastically, some made it reluctantly, but they all made it, because the alternative was clear. Be part of the future, or be crushed by it. The ones who resisted, the ones who clung to the old ways, they didn't last long. Within 2 years, Joe Masseria would be dead, shot in a Coney Island restaurant while Luciano was conveniently in the bathroom. Salvatore Maranzano would follow months later, killed in his own office. The mustache. Pete's would be wiped out, their territories absorbed, their power dissolved. And in their place would rise the National Crime Syndicate, the Commission, an organization that would control organized crime in America for decades. An organization built on the principles Lansky designed and Luciano enforced. But it all started in that room, with a briefcase, and a man who understood that submission doesn't come from violence. It comes from making people see that their self-interest aligns with your vision. The morning after the conference, Meyer Lansky stood on the Atlantic City boardwalk watching the sunrise. He didn't sleep much, never did. His mind was always working, always calculating, always several moves ahead of everyone else. That's what made him dangerous. Not muscle, not reputation, pure, relentless intelligence. The conference had gone better than he expected. The briefcase moment had done exactly what Luciano knew it would. It had shifted the psychology of the room, turned skeptics into believers, transformed a pitch into a movement. But Lansky knew that moments don't build empires. Systems do. Structure does. And now came the hard part. Taking that agreement, that fragile consensus reached in a smoke-filled room, and turning it into something real, something lasting. He thought about what Luciano had done, the brilliance of it. Not just the money, though the money mattered, but the way he had framed it, the price of entry, the investment in a shared future. It transformed the entire dynamic from bosses being told what to do, which they would never accept, to businessmen being offered an opportunity which they couldn't refuse. That was Luciano's gift. He understood people, not in a warm, empathetic way, but in a cold, mechanical way. He understood what motivated them, what frightened them, what they valued more than their pride. And he used that understanding like a weapon. They had met the night before the conference, Lansky and Luciano, in a different hotel room, just the two of them. Lansky had spread out papers, financial projections, organizational charts. He had spent months developing the framework for what they were about to propose. But Luciano had stopped him halfway through the presentation. He said that numbers wouldn't convince anyone. Structure wouldn't convince anyone. These men thought with their gut, not their head. They needed to feel something before they could think about it. Lansky had been frustrated at first. He had worked so hard on the details. But Luciano was right. He was always right about people. So they had planned the briefcase. Not with the precision Lansky usually demanded, but with the flexibility Luciano preferred. They knew the principle. Show them the money. Make it real. Make it impossible to ignore. Everything else was improvisation. That's what most people never understood about Luciano. He looked like a thug, talked like a thug, carried himself with the swagger of someone who had clawed his way up from nothing. But inside, he was as calculating as Lansky, just in a different way. Lansky calculated with numbers. Luciano calculated with psychology. Together, they were unstoppable. The sun was fully up now. The boardwalk was starting to fill with tourists, families, couples, people who had no idea that the men walking past them in expensive suits controlled more wealth and power than most legitimate businessmen would ever see. That was another thing Lansky appreciated about Atlantic City. the illusion of respectability, the way crime could hide in plain sight, dressed in nice clothes, staying in fancy hotels, pretending to be just another part of the American dream. Nucky Johnson, the political boss who controlled Atlantic City, had made that possible. He had turned the city into a haven for organized crime, a place where gangsters could meet without fear of police raids, where money could be laundered through legitimate businesses, where everyone from the mayor to the beat cops was on the payroll. Johnson had welcomed them all, hosted them, provided security. He understood that Atlantic City's economy depended on vice, on gambling and prostitution and bootlegging, on giving people what they wanted without judgment. In exchange, the mob poured money into the city, legitimate money, investments in hotels and restaurants and nightclubs. They made Atlantic City rich, and in return, Johnson made them safe. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship, one that Lansky wanted to replicate nationally. That's what the syndicate was really about. Not just coordinating criminal operations, though that was important, but building bridges between the underworld and the legitimate world, creating a system where crime and politics and business all worked together, where everyone profited, where stability replaced chaos. Some people called it corruption. Lansky called it efficiency. He walked back to the hotel. The conference was officially over, but many of the men were still there, talking in small groups, making side deals, building the relationships that would define the next decade of organized crime. Luciano was in the lobby, talking with Frank Costello. They stopped when they saw Lansky approaching. Costello smiled. He said that the younger guys were already talking about how much they should contribute to the treasury, that there was real excitement about what came next. Lansky nodded. That was good. Enthusiasm was important, but he was more interested in the older bosses, the ones who had been resistant, the ones who represented the biggest threat to the new order. Luciano read his mind. He said that some of them would never come around, that they were too invested in the old way, too proud, too stupid. But that was fine. They didn't need everyone. They just needed enough. And the ones who refused would become examples, cautionary tales about what happens when you choose the past over the future. There was a coldness in Luciano's voice when he said that, a certainty. Lansky had heard it before. It was the voice Luciano used when he had already decided someone was going to die. When the execution was just a matter of timing and method, Lansky didn't judge him for it, couldn't judge him for it, because Lansky had made the same calculations, had reached the same conclusions. The old guard had to go, not out of revenge, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. You couldn't build a new structure on a rotten foundation. You had to clear the ground first, completely. Do you think they were right? To eliminate anyone who stood in their way? The three of them, Lansky, Luciano, and Costello, went up to a suite. They ordered breakfast, expensive, lavish, the kind of meal that would feed a working-class family for a week. They ate and talked, not about the conference. That was done, decided. Now they talked about implementation, about who would control what, about how disputes would be resolved, about the commission that would govern everything. Lansky had already designed most of it. He explained how the commission would work. 5 families in New York, 1 representative from Chicago, 1 from Buffalo. They would meet regularly, vote on major decisions, settle conflicts, approve hits on made men. No boss could act unilaterally anymore. No individual could start a war. Everything would go through the commission. Everything would be decided collectively. It was revolutionary. In a world built on autocracy, on strongmen and dictators, Lansky was proposing democracy, criminal democracy, but democracy nonetheless. Costello loved it. He could see the stability it would bring, the predictability. He was a businessman at heart. He wanted structure, rules, things he could plan around. But Luciano was more skeptical. He understood the theory, but he also understood human nature. He said that men like Capone, like Dutch Schultz, they weren't built for compromise. They were built for conquest, and no matter how good the system looked on paper, someone would eventually try to break it. Lansky acknowledged that. He said the system had to have teeth, enforcement mechanisms. The commission would control Murder Incorporated, a dedicated enforcement arm. Killers who worked for the organization, not for individual bosses. Men like Bugsy Siegel, like Albert Anastasia. When the commission ordered a hit, it would be carried out, quickly, professionally. No questions asked. That was the stick. The carrot was profit. Under the new system, everyone would make more money. The bosses could focus on growing their operations instead of defending their territories. They could expand into new markets, new ventures, all coordinated, all optimized. Most men, Lansky believed, would choose money over independence, would choose stability over chaos, and the ones who didn't, well, that's what Murder Incorporated was for. The conversation went on for hours. They covered every detail, every contingency. Lansky had answers for everything. He had been thinking about this for years, long before the conference, long before most people realized the old system was dying. That was Lansky's real genius. Not just intelligence, but foresight. The ability to see where things were going before anyone else, to position himself ahead of the curve, to be ready when the moment arrived, and the moment had arrived. As the meeting broke up, Luciano pulled Lansky aside. He said something that stuck with Lansky for the rest of his life. He said that what they had done yesterday with the briefcase with the money, that wasn't just about organizing crime, it was about proving a principle. That power isn't just taken, it's given. And people give their power to whoever makes them believe it's in their best interest to do so. The old bosses used fear. They made people obey through violence, through intimidation, and it worked for a while. But it was inefficient, unstable, always one betrayal away from collapse. What Lansky and Luciano were building was different. They were making people want to follow, want to contribute, want to be part of something bigger than themselves. That, Luciano said, was real power, the kind that lasted, the kind that built empires. Lansky understood. He had always understood. But hearing Luciano articulate it so clearly, so simply, it crystallized something in his mind. They weren't just criminals. They were architects, building a new kind of organization, one that would outlast them both. 2 weeks after the Atlantic City conference, Meyer Lansky was back in New York. The city felt different now, or maybe it was him that felt different. He walked through the Lower East Side where he had grown up, past the tenements and pushcarts and the endless flow of immigrants trying to carve out a life in America. He remembered being one of them. A kid fresh off the boat from Poland, skinny, scared, speaking broken English. The other kids had mocked him, beaten him up, taken what little he had, until he learned to fight back, until he learned that the world didn't reward weakness, that survival meant being smarter, tougher, more ruthless than everyone around you. He had learned those lessons well, too well, some might say. Now he controlled gambling operations across the city. He had politicians in his pocket, cops on his payroll. He could walk into the finest restaurants and the finest hotels, and people would treat him with respect, not because they liked him, but because they feared what he represented: power, real power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He met Luciano at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy. They sat in the back, away from the windows. Old habit: never sit where you can be seen from the street. Never let your back face the door. Luciano looked tired. He had been busy since Atlantic City, meeting with the different families, explaining the new structure, making sure everyone understood their role. It was exhausting work, political work, the kind of work that required patience and diplomacy and the ability to smile at men you wanted to strangle. But it was necessary. The conference had created momentum. Now they had to maintain it, had to turn agreement into action, had to prove that the new system actually worked. Lansky asked how it was going. Luciano said it was going well. Most of the guys were on board. They could see the potential. They liked the idea of making more money with less risk, of having structure, of knowing the rules. But there were holdouts, stubborn old bastards who refused to see reason, who saw the commission as a threat to their authority, who would rather fight than cooperate. Joe Masseria was the biggest problem. He was Luciano's boss, the man Luciano theoretically answered to. But Masseria was everything the old guard represented: greedy, violent, short-sighted. He saw the new generation as a threat, as kids who needed to be taught respect. And respect in Maseria's world meant submission, meant doing what you were told without question, meant accepting your place in the hierarchy and never challenging it. Luciano couldn't live like that, wouldn't live like that. He was too ambitious, too smart, too aware of his own capabilities to spend his life taking orders from a man he didn't respect. Something had to give, and both he and Lansky knew what that something was. Lansky didn't say it out loud, didn't need to. They had known each other too long, could read each other too well, but the question hung in the air between them. When? Luciano said soon, after Maranzano was dealt with, after the other old bosses were neutralized. They would do it all at once, one massive purge. The night of the Sicilian Vespers, some would later call it, though that name came later from newspapers and historians trying to make sense of what had happened. It would be bloody, unavoidable. Dozens of men would die, maybe more. Every major city would see violence, but it would be quick, surgical, and when it was over, the old guard would be gone, erased, and the new generation would be in charge. Lansky listened. His face gave away nothing, but inside, he was running calculations, thinking through logistics, identifying risks, planning contingencies. That was his role. Luciano was the face, the leader, the one who inspired loyalty and commanded respect. But Lansky was the brain, the strategist, the one who made sure that plans didn't just sound good, but actually worked. He asked Luciano about timing, about coordination, about making sure that everyone moved at the same time, that no one got cold feet, that no one warned the targets. Luciano said he was working on it, that Costello was helping, that they were building a list, identifying who needed to go, who could be turned, who could be trusted. It was delicate work, dangerous work. One mistake, one leak, and the whole thing could blow up in their faces. They would be the ones getting killed instead of doing the killing. But that was the game. That was what it meant to play at this level. You risked everything because the alternative was accepting less than everything. And neither of them had come this far, survived this much, to accept less. They finished eating, talked about other things, business, money, investments. Lansky was always thinking about investments, about how to take dirty money and turn it clean, how to build legitimate businesses that could shelter criminal profits. He had ideas about Cuba, about casinos and hotels, about creating a Caribbean playground for rich Americans. A place where gambling was legal and the local government could be bought cheap. It would take years to build, require enormous capital, but Lansky could see it, could see exactly how it would work, could see the money flowing in. That was his gift, seeing the future, and then making it happen. They parted ways outside the restaurant. Luciano headed uptown. Lansky headed downtown. Two men moving through the same city, but living in completely different worlds from the people around them. Most people would never understand what they had built, would never see past the surface. The violence, the crime, the breaking of laws. But Lansky understood something that most people refused to accept, that society's rules were arbitrary, that law was just organized force, that morality was whatever the people in power said it was. He hadn't made the world this way. He had just learned to navigate it better than most. Over the next year, everything Lansky and Luciano had planned came to fruition. The purge happened. Masseria, Maranzano, dozens of others, all killed within hours of each other. Coordinated, precise, exactly as planned. The newspapers called it gang warfare. The police launched investigations that went nowhere. Politicians gave speeches about law and order, and the underworld quietly reorganized itself under new leadership. The commission was established. The rules were set. Territory was divided. And for the first time in decades, there was peace in the criminal underworld. Not because people had become less violent, but because violence now had structure, rules, consequences. Murder for personal reasons was forbidden. Murder for business reasons had to be approved. The chaos that had threatened to destroy everything was replaced by cold, calculated order. And at the center of it all was Meyer Lansky, not the face of it. He never wanted to be the face. But the architect, the mind that designed the machine that would run organized crime in America for the next 50 years. Luciano got more credit. He was the boss, the capo di tutti capi, the man other bosses answered to, and he deserved credit. He had taken enormous risks, had betrayed his own boss, had led the revolution that changed everything, but he couldn't have done it without Lansky, without the planning, the strategy, the financial genius that made it all possible. Years later, after Luciano had been deported to Italy, after his empire had been taken away, he would say that the smartest thing he ever did was partner with Meyer Lansky, that trying to go it alone would have gotten him killed, that the briefcase moment at Atlantic City wasn't just about money, it was about demonstrating what partnership could achieve, what intelligence and force combined could build, that in a world of sharks, it paid to have the smartest shark on your side. Have you ever wondered what you would have done in their position? 1931. The year everything changed. Joe Masseria died on April 15th, shot multiple times in a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. He was eating dinner, playing cards, relaxed, unguarded. Lucky Luciano had been with him. They had been discussing business. Then Luciano excused himself, went to the bathroom, and while he was gone, 4 men walked in and opened fire. Masseria never had a chance. He died face down in his spaghetti. The newspapers loved that detail, made it sound almost poetic. The old world boss, killed while eating old world food. Luciano returned to find him dead, acted shocked, grieved appropriately. No one believed him, of course. Everyone knew what had happened, but knowing and proving are different things. Masseria's death created a vacuum. Salvatore Maranzano moved quickly to fill it, declared himself boss of bosses, tried to reorganize the families under his leadership. Luciano played along, pretended to accept the new order for 5 months. On September 10th, Maranzano was killed in his own office, stabbed and shot by men pretending to be federal agents. It was clean, professional, no witnesses willing to talk. And that same day, across the country, dozens of other old guard bosses were killed. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, coordinated hits, all within hours of each other. The night of the Sicilian Vespers, the purge that Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano had been planning since Atlantic City. When the smoke cleared, the entire structure of organized crime had been rewritten. The mustache Petes were gone. The old rules were dead. And in their place was the Commission, the National Crime Syndicate, the New Order. Meyer Lansky's vision had become reality. He didn't celebrate. That wasn't his style. He just moved forward, started implementing the systems he had designed. The territories were divided. The rules were established. The enforcement mechanisms were put in place. And the money started flowing. More money than anyone had imagined possible. Because that's what peace does. It creates efficiency. It reduces waste. It allows everyone to focus on making money instead of fighting wars. The bootlegging operations expanded. The gambling networks grew. The narcotics trade was organized. And every operation paid a percentage to the Commission Treasury, the fund that Luciano had started with that briefcase at Atlantic City. Lansky managed it all. He was the Commission's accountant, their financial brain. He kept the books, tracked the money, made sure everyone got their cut, and he skimmed. Not much, just enough. Because Lansky understood that the person who controls the money has the real power, not the loudest voice, not the biggest reputation, but the one who decides how resources are allocated. That was his insurance policy, his guarantee that no matter what happened, he would survive, because everyone needed him, everyone depended on him, and no one fully understood how the system worked, except him. He had learned that lesson from the Rothschilds, from the great banking families of Europe, that financial intelligence beats physical force every time, that the man who holds the purse strings controls the man who holds the gun. Luciano understood it too. That's why their partnership worked so well. Luciano had the charisma, the leadership, the ability to command men, but he knew his limitations, knew he needed Lansky's mind to turn ambition into achievement, and Lansky knew he needed Luciano's force to protect what they built, to be the face that dealt with the violent, unstable world of organized crime, to be the lightning rod that drew attention away from Lansky himself. It was symbiotic, perfectly balanced. each man compensating for the other's weaknesses, each man amplifying the other's strengths. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, they would have been just another couple of gangsters who rose and fell. But their partnership wouldn't last forever. Nothing does. In 1936, Luciano was arrested, not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for prostitution, compulsory prostitution, a charge that Thomas Dewey, the ambitious prosecutor, used to take down New York's most powerful mobster. The trial was a sham. The witnesses were coerced. The evidence was fabricated. But it didn't matter. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years. It should have been the end of him, the end of his empire, the end of the partnership with Lansky. But it wasn't, because Lansky understood something fundamental. That power isn't location-dependent, that a man in prison can still give orders if the right systems are in place, if the right people remain loyal. And Lansky made sure those systems existed. He managed Luciano's interests while he was gone, kept his operations running, made sure he was still getting paid, still relevant, still in control. Visitors went to see Luciano regularly. Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, others. They would sit across from him in the prison visiting room, talking in code, making decisions, running an empire from behind bars. The authorities knew what was happening, but they couldn't stop it, because the system Lansky had built was too sophisticated, too insulated, too distributed. No single point of failure. That was the key. Even with Luciano in prison, the commission kept functioning. The families kept operating. The money kept flowing. During World War II, Luciano cut a deal with the government. He provided intelligence about the New York waterfront, helped prevent sabotage, protected military shipments. In exchange, he got his sentence commuted, got deported to Italy instead of spending decades in prison. Lansky orchestrated the whole thing, connected Luciano with the right intelligence officers, negotiated the terms, made sure his partner didn't die in prison. Some people called it unpatriotic. Accused Lansky and Luciano of manipulating the war effort for personal gain. But Lansky didn't care what people called it. He had saved his partner, kept their empire intact. That's what mattered. Luciano left for Italy in 1946. He would never set foot in America again. But he remained connected, remained influential, because Lansky kept him connected, kept him relevant. They would meet in Cuba, in Italy, in other neutral locations, planning new ventures, discussing strategy, making decisions that affected operations across the hemisphere. The briefcase at Atlantic City had been just the beginning, the seed of something that grew beyond anything either of them had imagined. A criminal empire that spanned continents, that controlled billions of dollars, that influenced governments and corporations. And it all started with understanding one simple principle: that power submits to vision, that men follow whoever shows them a better future, that the person who controls the money controls everything. Luciano had walked into that conference room with $120,000 and a clear understanding of human nature. He had used both to change the world, not for the better, perhaps, but change it nonetheless. And Meyer Lansky had been there every step of the way, the quiet genius, the shadow partner, the man who made it all possible. Years later, when federal investigators finally tried to take Lansky down, they discovered something frustrating. He had hidden his money so well, structured his operations so carefully, that they couldn't prove anything, couldn't trace the funds, couldn't connect him to specific crimes. He died in Miami in 1983, broke, according to official records. The government had seized what little they could find, but everyone knew it was bullshit. Knew that Lansky had stashed hundreds of millions somewhere, had created financial structures so complex that even the best investigators couldn't untangle them. He took those secrets to his grave, never talked, never betrayed anyone, never gave up the system he had spent his life building. That was Meyer Lansky, brilliant, ruthless, loyal, a man who understood that real power doesn't announce itself. It just operates, quietly, efficiently, until it's so embedded in the system that it becomes the system, and it all started with a briefcase, and a man who knew how to use it. The lesson of the briefcase isn't really about money. Money was just the tool, the medium, the language that everyone in that room understood. The real lesson is about power, about how it's created, how it's maintained, how it's transferred from one person to another. Most people think power comes from strength, from force, from the ability to hurt others. And force matters, certainly. The mob was built on violence, on the willingness to kill anyone who stood in the way. But force alone doesn't create lasting power. It creates fear. And fear is unstable, unpredictable, always one betrayal away from collapse. Real power, the kind that lasts, comes from making people believe they benefit from your success, from aligning their interests with yours, from creating a system where following you is more profitable than opposing you. That's what Luciano understood when he walked into that conference room. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was trying to recruit them, to show them that the future he and Lansky were building was better than anything they could build alone. The money proved it, demonstrated that cooperation worked, that pooling resources created opportunities that individual operations couldn't access. That organization beat chaos every single time. And once men saw that, once they understood the math, the logic, the basic economics of it, they couldn't unsee it, couldn't go back to the old way without feeling like they were leaving money on the table. That's genius, pure, cold genius, using human nature against itself, using greed, which had always divided criminals, to unite them instead. Meyer Lansky understood this at an even deeper level than Luciano. He understood that power isn't held by individuals. It's held by systems, by structures that outlast any single person, by institutions that keep functioning regardless of who's in charge. That's what the commission was. An institution, a structure that could survive arrests and deportations and deaths, that could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining its core principles. Lansky built it to last, and it did last, decades. Long after he and Luciano were gone, long after most of the original members were dead or in prison, the basic structure remained. The families, the commission, the rules about how business was conducted. It eventually broke down, of course. Everything does. The RICO laws, the FBI investigations, the pressure from law enforcement, the internal conflicts and betrayals. By the end of the 20th century, the commission was a shadow of what it had been. But for 50 years, it worked. It brought stability to chaos. It turned petty criminals into businessmen. It created one of the most successful criminal organizations in history. All because two men understood something that others didn't, that intelligence beats force, that systems beat individuals, that the person who designs the game wins more often than the person who plays the hardest. There's another lesson buried in this story, one that makes some people uncomfortable. It's about the relationship between crime and society, about the gray area where illegal activity and legitimate business overlap, because the mob didn't operate in isolation. It couldn't have. Every speakeasy needed customers, every gambling operation needed players, every corrupt politician needed voters who looked the other way. The mob succeeded because society wanted what it offered, wanted alcohol during Prohibition, wanted gambling and prostitution and entertainment, wanted the escape from mundane life that vice provides. Lansky understood that. He understood that crime is just another business, that it responds to demand like any other industry, that the key to success isn't breaking the law, it's giving people what they want while managing the risk of getting caught. That's why he focused on gambling. It was relatively victimless. People chose to gamble. They weren't being robbed or assaulted, they were just making bad financial decisions, which people do every day in legal ways. And gambling could be glamorous, could be packaged and sold as entertainment, could attract wealthy people who wanted excitement, who wanted to feel alive. That's what he built in Cuba, what he tried to build in Las Vegas before he lost control. Not just casinos, but experiences, places where people could forget their problems and pretend to be someone else for a night. He made crime respectable, or at least he made it appealing to respectable people, which is almost the same thing. The final lesson is about partnership, about what happens when two brilliant people recognize each other and decide to work together instead of competing. Lansky and Luciano could have been enemies. Their backgrounds were different. Their skills were different. Their approaches to problems were different. In another context, they might have fought for dominance, might have killed each other, but they chose partnership instead. Chose to see each other's strengths as complementary rather than threatening. chose to build something together that neither could have built alone. And that partnership changed everything, created something bigger than either of them, created an organization that outlasted them both. There's something profound in that, something that applies beyond organized crime, the recognition that ego is expensive, that insisting on doing everything yourself limits what you can achieve. That finding the right partner multiplies your capabilities exponentially. Luciano had the charisma and the courage. Lansky had the brains and the discipline. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, they would have been just another couple of ambitious criminals who rose quickly and fell hard. So what happened in that conference room at Atlantic City in 1929 wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about organizing crime. It was about two men demonstrating a principle that most people never learn. That power isn't taken, it's given, by people who see that following you benefits them more than opposing you, that systems outlast individuals, that the person who builds the machine matters more than the person who works the machine, that intelligence beats force, that planning beats instinct, that the quiet genius in the corner often shapes history more than the loud voice at the front of the room. Lucky Luciano walked into that room with $120,000 and a vision of the future. He showed everyone that the old way was dying, that a new way was possible, that cooperation could be more profitable than competition. And every man in that room made a choice, some quickly, some reluctantly, but they all chose to be part of what came next, to contribute, to buy into the system that Lansky and Luciano were building, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to, because the math made sense, because the alternative was being left behind while everyone else moved forward. That's submission, not through violence, not through fear, but through understanding, through self-interest, through the recognition that sometimes following someone else's plan is smarter than dying for your own. It's a lesson that applies everywhere, in business, in politics, in any situation where power is contested. The person who wins isn't always the strongest or the loudest. It's the person who makes others believe that winning with them is better than winning without them. Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano understood that. They built an empire on that understanding, an empire that shaped American history, that influenced how crime was organized for decades, that proved that criminals could be just as sophisticated, just as strategic as any legitimate business leader. They're gone now, dead for decades. Their empire has crumbled. The world they built has been dismantled by law enforcement and time, but the lesson remains. The principle holds. Power submits to vision. Men follow whoever shows them a better future, and the person who controls the money controls the destiny of everyone else. That's what happened in Atlantic City. That's what the briefcase represented. Not just cash, but a new way of thinking, a new way of organizing, a new understanding of how power really works. And once that understanding entered the room, nothing was ever the same again. The men who were there that day walked out different than they walked in. They had seen something, understood something, recognized that the future had arrived and they could either be part of it or be crushed by it. Most chose to be part of it, and those who didn't, well, they didn't last long, because that's how evolution works. The old gives way to the new. The strong adapt or die. The smart recognize change and embrace it. The stubborn cling to what they know and wonder why the world leaves them behind. Luciano and Lansky weren't just criminals. They were evolutionaries. They saw where the world was going and got there first. They built the infrastructure that everyone else would use. They set the rules that everyone else would follow. And they did it with a briefcase full of money and the intelligence to know exactly how to use it. That's the story. That's what happened. That's why, decades later, people still talk about that conference, still study it, still try to understand how two men changed an entire industry in a single afternoon. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was understanding. It was preparation. It was two brilliant minds working in perfect synchronization to solve a problem that had seemed unsolvable. They proved that chaos could become order, that competition could become cooperation, that criminals could build something sophisticated and lasting, and they proved that the right move at the right time can change everything. Luciano walked in with $120,000. He walked out with an empire, not because he bought it, but because he showed everyone else how to build it together. That's power, real power, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that echoes through history, the kind that changes the world.